Well, still talking about Fiona Green and Amber Mattingly, who were linked, each of whom was linked to me, and each of whom, as it turns out, was linked to Greg Byworth, who was also linked to me. I crossed twice today the road where Amber Mattingly was killed, and still cannot see how on earth a bike could crash into a lorry dead ahead and not see it in the morning, unless it was incredibly foggy, and no mention was made of that. It was the 23rd of March. Traffic lights, all sorts, as has been mentioned by other people, intersections there. Can't see how on earth it could happen. This is that. And I managed to get to Fiona's grave, which is also her mother's grave. And I noticed it looks brand new. Although Ellen was buried there over 10 years ago, and Fiona was buried there nearly 22 years ago. In other words, somebody is keeping the grave up. I can only think of one person who might do that, and I would imagine it's more for Fiona's sake than Ellen's sake. And if it's who I think it is, she's not quite as disappeared as I thought. Not so totally vanished off the map. Well, I know where her husband is, at least roughly. Of course, being in Southampton has brought back a huge amount of everything I've been talking about. Massive. I mentioned the possibility that somebody could have sneaked into my parents' house in the dark on the night of the 20th of December 1989. And I'd almost forgotten, and in point of fact, there's a street lamp right outside it. So it wouldn't be quite that easy. Unless, of course, you were someone who was a regular visitor and nobody would think about it. You'd probably go down the slope and nobody see you, but you've got to come back up again. And presumably you've got to drive away, and that would be seen. But also, as a result of the work of fiction on TV, I was thinking a little bit about hitmen. Now, in fiction, the hitmen always, I don't know, it's always a bullet to the head or something, and therefore it's very, very clear that it's murder. And with the exception of Samuel McKinley and Martin Brooke Warwick, well, Samuel McKinley's victim, his victim was Robin Stoddart, who was at Fiona's death. The victim was stabbed to death. Martin Brooke Warwick was stabbed to death. Again, very, very clearly murders. So many of the ones I know about fit very much, actually, with my father's modus operandum, which was to make it look either natural or accidental. Enough suspicion, as I've said before, to guarantee an inquest, and not enough to guarantee that they would be investigated as murders. I do come back to my father was present at my mother's death, was present at Fiona's death. One, I know, was asphyxiation, my mother. Fiona's, I believe, to have been drowning. Those that have both been, I'm sorry, right up my father's alley. I know he liked to do that kind of thing. I also know that he liked to watch suffering. He really enjoyed watching suffering. So although there are possibilities, i.e. that he was an observer, not the active malefactor, I come back to, actually, it was him. What threw me a little was being in Romsey Abbey, Sunday before last, I think it was. and remembering my father setting foot in there voluntarily. A place of worship. It was the first time I'd ever seen him walk into a Christian or any other place of worship voluntarily. And not only did he go in voluntarily, but he sat on a pew and he cried after my mother's death. Well, needless to say, at the time of my mother's death, I was deeply suspicious of his action or lack of action. But of course, when I saw him crying, I thought I must be wrong. Well, it's not impossible to kill somebody in the heat of the moment and grieve afterwards and be remorseful afterwards. That's totally possible. What I don't think is possible, or I hadn't thought was possible, and I've still got my doubts, is to plan a murder in cold blood and then weep over it after and be remorseful after. That's something I can't get my head around at all. And yet, for my mother to have died in the hour between my leaving and my father phoning to say that she was dead, I can't see that was not planned in advance. He would have had to act awfully quickly. And again with Fiona's murder, somebody told him, well, presumably Robin Stoddart told him where Fiona was, because how did he know otherwise? She wasn't at her home address. And I can't believe Robin Stoddart was probably drugged out of his mind, if form is anything to go by, and wouldn't have been in a fit state to particularly want to murder anyone, let alone the goose who was laying the golden eggs. Frankly. Again, it comes down to it must have been planned, unless, of course, Robin Stoddart really was worried about Fiona and somehow did have my father's telephone number, and my father went over there and jumped up and killed her. I'm not sure about that one, given that he was 78 at the time, and my brother insists that he knew that he had terminal cancer. My daughter did not know, and she was living in his home. And I didn't know, and I was living around the corner. Both of us thought he had diverticulitis and was going to my brother's to recuperate from diverticulitis and would return to his home. So he's 78. Apparently knew he had terminal cancer. I do have to ask myself what was to gain in that case from murdering Fiona, unless, of course, it fitted in somewhere with his satanic religion. Unless she was some sort of sacrifice to get him to wherever he wanted to go after life was over. Can't quite get my head around that one, but nevertheless, I have come back to, sorry, he was present at both deaths, and they were his style. Mine is not a reason why, mine is just to look at what I know. Then, of course, there were two crashes. Karen's, which he could have been involved in very, very easily, and I believe he was. And then Amber's followed exactly the same pattern, but she followed that pattern in 2010. And whether my father died in 94 or 2000, he was most definitely dead by 2010. But of course he had colleagues, and he had people who came after him in this ring. But I have on my list mostly natural causes, two accidents, and okay, 2 stabbings. My father could not have been responsible for either stabbing, it has to be said, but his colleagues could. He couldn't have been responsible for Martin Brooke Warwick's death because that was in 2002, and he couldn't have been responsible for Robin Stoddart's death he could have technically in 96 if he was alive until 2000, but he wasn't. That was Samuel McKinley. Am I waffling? I hope not. Just wasted 10 minutes if I am. I'll stop and think.